I think what I'm really passionate about is how do we better communicate this amazing world of architecture? And here's what it means to be good architecture. And also, here's how we can make the world better. Here's a better way to do these things. Welcome to Denver.
Yeah, thanks. It's nice. You're from Denver originally?
No, I grew up in Kansas. No, so I've been here for about 8 years.
So Hilo Buffalo. It's your one-person firm, is that right?
One person firm, Hilo Buffalo. Funny, I had a list of probably like 500 names, and I've just scrolled through, and it just became this obsessive thing. Got 2 little kids, and when you ask a little kid like what do they do during their day, you never get a response back.
Yeah.
And so our friends told us about Hilo Buffalo, where it's the high and the low, but then we would say, now what's your Buffalo, which is the interesting, weird, kind of crazy thing that happened. That's what I'm searching for and striving for, is finding that crazy, wild, interesting kind of thing, and like making architecture being a sort of like beacon that becomes that buffalo in someone's life. Tell me a bit more about the sort of like history of Lake Flato and what it's grown into, and what do you guys do?
So Lake Flato, 150-person firm based out of San Antonio, Texas. So there's 5 studios at Lake Flato: residential, higher education, learning, which is K through 12, eco-conservation, which is the coolest named studio, and then urban planning. So those are the 5 studios. And in 2019, Architect Magazine ranked it the #1 firm in the US, which is pretty cool. And then this year, I think, as you heard, our 2 partners, Lake and Flato, won the AIA Gold Medal Award. So everybody in the firm has just been on cloud 9.
So where do you fit in within the firm? How do you
Good question.
interact? Yeah.
I work on all the projects and none of the projects.
Yeah.
So my title is Director of Design Technology. I also lead our research program. And then I'm sort of half embedded into our design performance studio. So 150-person firm. We have 5 people that are dedicated to design performance, which is a pretty high number for that size firm.
I'm jealous of that role, that sort of like floating expert role
Yep.
within architecture, But how did you cultivate these expertise? There's a typical kind of path within architecture of going to school and going to a firm and kind of going down the project management route. Like, how did you able to branch off in all these kind of technical aspects?
The best answer to that is a book. I love referencing books. I brought one today to share. But one book by Randy Deutsch, he's an architecture professor in Chicago. He wrote this book called Super Users, and he chronicles that very thing. Like, I actually created this role at Lake Flato. I wrote the business plan and worked with the leadership to create this position. And it's a new kind of lane within AEC, the design technology. It's different than IT, and it's meant to elevate the use of technology for design, which is really important if we want to be more efficient and do things more sustainably. Randy wrote this book that highlights, the chronicles the idea that once you switch out of that traditional lane, there's some glass ceilings that are sort of artificially put in place. And then because of that, then there tends to be this peel off out of the traditional architecture role into software.
Like I said, I was jealous of your role, and I like going down those kind of wormholes and exploring different things. But yeah, being a one-person architecture firm, there's not a lot of time or margin to do that, or I create a lot of time for it, but I don't get to eat for 2 months, and
In some ways, you have the opportunity to kind of create the best results, but with the limited resources, right? You don't have to ask permission to do something.
That's true.
You can take more chances and more risks and potentially reap more rewards.
Yeah. There's the highs and the lows and the buffaloes in that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So speaking of that, can you tell me about your firm? Like, what kind of projects do you do?
This is sort of the 4th iteration of my firm. So the first, I graduated from Kansas State University in 2009 in the recession.
Yeah.
And I think 3 of our class of 60 people got jobs. And my vegetarian doctor uncle in Wichita, Kansas, decided he wanted to start a hot dog restaurant, and so he hired us to my now wife and I to design this hot dog restaurant. And so, kind of at 23, we started this firm, and like I don't even know where. Maybe we went on like Craigslist to find a registered architect to stamp our drawings, and we meet with her every other week at a Starbucks, and we designed and then kind of built a lot of the restaurant too. And I think looking back at it, it was like a set of like 7 pages or something. And then from that, I guess getting to your question of like what High-Low Buffalo is, that was sort of a sort of platform for the things I'm interested in, and where I've started this podcast here in Colorado called Architecting that interviews Colorado architects. The goal of it is to really help foster community among the design professionals here in Colorado, where it's really pretty siloed. And so creating High-Low Buffalo is like this thing where it's an architecture firm that I focus on single family residential and also sort of ideas and competitions based stuff. It's a umbrella for the podcast and expanding that into different kind of media things, kind of future pushing into being a design consultant for other firms, whether if it's technology or if it's design or whatever. And then also I teach at the University of Colorado here. So it kind of allows me to do all those things. And I'm trying to figure out how to juggle it all and stay sort of focused.
At Yale, did you have Phil Bernstein as a professor?
I did, yeah. We had like a business of architecture.
Yeah. Phil Bernstein was still at Pelly's office when I worked on this music hall for the University of Minnesota. And he wrote the contract for the project. And then fast forward a couple of years later, and I came showing up at this Minneapolis executive Autodesk luncheon where the current CEO, Carol Bartz, and Vice President Phil Bernstein were. Right. And they both signed the cover of my first Revit book, which I still have at home.
Nice. Because he was pretty instrumental in like the development of Revit, wasn't he, Phil?
I believe he and Carol basically wrote the check to buy Revit. Right. And one thing that's cool at Lake Plato is I kind of think of us as the dynamic duo. So I'm the director of design technology, and we have this guy, Stephen Campbell, who's our BIM manager. He actually worked at Revit before the Autodesk acquisition. Right. And then between the two, Autodesk and Revit Technologies for 17 years. Wow. So he's the guy that's
a good BIM manager to have.
I know, he's making our template and our content, and he makes this like really high quality assets for our real-time visualization, which is pretty cool.
What is it? You have the #1 Revit training?
Yeah, I have written 19 textbooks, and one of those books is the #1 Revit book in North America in the academic market.
So how did you get into it then? I mean, I remember in graduating in 2009, Revit was sort of like a quarter of the people doing it, right? Yep. When did you get into it?
I was teaching at a technical college, back AutoCAD and Revit back in Minnesota. And I got this postcard in the mail from a publisher from Kansas City, Mission, Kansas, actually. So middle of the road publisher, not a giant one, but not a little boutique publisher either.
And when was this? Like what year?
Early 2000s. Okay. Yeah. And so I ended up talking to the publisher on the phone. I was calling to try and get a sample copy of a book, and they mainly had engineering books at the time. And I said, I want an architecture book that does this, that, and he said, well, we don't really have that, but how would you like to write one? And I paused for 10 seconds, and the rest is history.
Did you get into a firm and start using it early, and then able to get into teaching it, and then just sort of more and more become that guy? And
yeah, I mean, it all just sort of gelled. I mean, I really like teaching. That's both my role in the firm I work for, the books I've written, and basically teaching as a professor, right?
You still teach, yeah, right?
Yeah, this fall semester will be my 10th year teaching at NDSU, North Dakota State University, graduate architecture students, which is pretty fun because a lot of the students at graduate level, they've already used Revit in an internship or, working a side job, and almost every one of them say, I didn't realize Revit could do this much, because we get into energy modeling and massing and conceptual massing.
Yeah. It's funny you talked about sort of doing more advanced things with Revit and a lot of people not knowing the possibilities. I was sort of in that camp in undergrad where I was like, it can't do great design. It's clunky and it's come a long ways. And the summer of grad school, I went and worked for Cesar Pelli for a summer, and they really actually they taught me Revit there and like really expanded how they use it. We were doing a bunch of towers and a lot of conceptual massing and a lot of like integrating it in with Grasshopper and stuff. And then when I went back to grad school the next semester, I had Peter Eisman for studio, and he came in and essentially said, "There's no Revit in this class. Like you don't use it." And I was partnered with another post-professional student who was also working at Pelly, and we just said, "Screw that." And we were using Revit the whole time, and he never knew. And the whole time we were using conceptual masses, we had scrubbed it out where it doesn't look like Revit, and we were able to work so quickly. And at one point, we had done these print-offs for a mid-crit, and Eisenman said, like, everyone should be making drawings like this. And he was pointing at a Revit screenshot, like printed off, and everybody else, was doing Rhino and Make 2D, bring it into Illustrator every day for him, And then we ended up like winning like the class of the project of the semester or whatever, and he never knew the whole time. Yeah, there we go.
Well, and I think there's always like using the right tool for the right thing, but
Right.
there's often, and I look at a Rhino or a SketchUp model and see it's some fairly simple rectilinear building. That can be done 10 times easier in Revit. I mean, it's just, it can be a design tool. I
Right.
mean, it's how you use the tool to design.
And it's how you change your mindset. And I think like, talking about sort of what are some issues within firms, I see that all the time of the last few firms I've worked at or my wife's at Gensler, always having like a SketchUp model and a Revit model going at the same time. That's my biggest frustration, right? Of like, what are you doing? It's just because you're not as comfortable with designing in this one program. And there's some things that can go a little faster in SketchUp or a little bit quicker. But the idea of translating that back and forth and keeping those two updated is just drives me crazy.
Well, Lake Plato does use SketchUp, but our residential studio, which is an award-winning studio, and it's like 35-40% of our work of this 150-person firm. Actually, only one person in our entire residential studio has SketchUp installed on their computer. They might use models and some other physical things as part of the design process, but the Revit process is the main thing. And like to me, in terms of efficiency and accuracy and the ability to like people to work together and not be siloed, like if we can just focus on a common set of tools and not have two things that do like 85% the same thing. And of course, every product's going to have one thing that's a little better than another, but it doesn't make it worth training, paying for, supporting 2, 3, 4 different things.
I get excited by format. I haven't like played around with it a ton, but being that idea of like this is sort of SketchUp-ish that you can play around, that it has a lot more robust sort of tools to it, and then it transitions to Revit. And I know you've like done a bunch of videos and training on that.
Forma is amazing. It's probably one of the most used new tools at Lake Plato. We're doing it on so many projects, and the tool itself is really quite transformative in a lot of ways. Doing anything early on, right? Everybody says it, almost nobody does it. Let's do an energy model.
Right.
Let's do wind analysis and things like that, and embodied carbon analysis, like while the project's still adjustable. Climate Studio actually wrote a blog post. It's Salima, the company, about a project, a middle school we were designing in New Mexico. And the whole point of the blog post, of course, part of it was that we used their tool to do daylighting, but the fact that our design performance team at Lake Plato worked with the design team in the office so early in the project that you could see in the iterations the design actually changing. Like we had a gymnasium that we were able to get to 100% spatial daylight autonomy. We ended up adding a perforated panel over part of the exterior windows. We added a skylight and then moved the skylight around, and you can do these different massing options, and the massing can be done in Forma. Autodesk even made an add-in to Rhino that is a connector. It's not quite a live connector, but there's a push-pull button. So you hit pull and it pulls in the contextual geometry. You can make some really cool stuff and then push it into Forma. So with these different options of geometry, you can do wind analysis. And while you're pushing things around, if you're doing the massing in Forma, Forma's using AI to do wind analysis, so the heat maps of the wind. Another thing that we've been doing a lot lately, which is really cool in our urban planning and mixed use projects, is traffic noise analysis. And it actually projects a heat map in decibels onto the surface and the face of the building of the noise from cars and railroad tracks. Most recently, Autodesk partnered with the architecture firm in San Francisco, EHDD Architects. EHDD created this tool called Epic, and it has this machine learning / AI backend database called C-Scale. And this has real world embodied carbon data for buildings. And then it also has really granular detail, like down to the zip code level emissions for concrete mix plants. So they have all that data in there that they've just recently added to Autodesk Forma. So if you create a mass in Forma and then you specify like a handful of things, it already knows where you are on the earth. You specify the structure, the HVAC system, the types of interiors, and then it gives you an embodied carbon budget.
You know, I think that's really interesting of like the difference between where we're each working, right? And the idea of sort of, okay, yeah, we all want more sustainable buildings and buildings that are helping along this way. But how do we get there? For me, single family, maybe people are saying, yeah, we want more sustainable design. Probably about 50% of my projects, 75% of my projects don't make it out of DD because they just don't price out in this economy right now, and they're not even, going above and beyond with sustainability. To me, and where I'm starting to dive into Forma and want to do it more is of, thinking about passive strategies, right? Where I've been trained in that early on and trying to think about orientation of a building, sizes of openings, shading, etc. I have a friend named Miles Dake here in Denver, where he's a MEP engineer and a licensed architect. And so I try to bring him in on every project, and he's running energy models and things. I give him the model, comes back a week later and he gives me numbers, and I'm like, okay, well, let's kind of tweak this. But having that real time thing, right, is really powerful, because I think if we're talking about, okay, sustainable architecture, right, it's such a big umbrella,
Right.
And what is it and what do we have control over, right? We have control over sort of overall envelope size, right, until you get to kind of larger commercial scale where you're just pushing up against the zoning envelope or whatever. You have materials that you're choosing, right? Embodied energy and sort of healthiness of those materials. But a lot of those decisions, right, are made at a ownership level or something else. My wife, Rebecca Wagner, is at Gensler, and she was just this morning talking to me about, Gensler, the size of them, they're able to sort of demand higher qualities in their materials. And so they say, we only keep these certain materials at these sort of embodied energy levels in our library. And there's a lot of companies that weren't hitting that. And within 2 months, a lot of them had changed their products just to be within that, right, of the size. No one's doing that to me, right? But to like at your scale, and when you're working with these things and saying, okay, hey, let's do Dow laminated instead of CLT, right? Or let's do this. Here's the metrics. Here's how we're gathering this. I think there's a lot of power to that, but there's still a lot of could be pushback of price or whatever, and making that real business case. Probably you have to do that all the time, right?
There's lots of ways of approaching that. So one of them is at the education level, like we both teach and at university to architecture students. So I always emphasize the agency that architects can have in the industry when they're talking to clients. In fact, the AIA Code of Ethics requires architects to have discussions about the environmental impacts of their projects, which I think is really interesting. When we approach any project, we always try to have that idea that we are the design professional. We're trying to provide solutions that are optimal. And then another cool thing that we've done residentially that's sustainable is, and this has been in the works for 10 years now, something called Porch House. It's a modular home. So it's a Lake Flato quality designed modules that it's not quite like a catalog, but you can kind of pick from a list of pieces, but they're still highly optimized and pre-planned to minimize waste, which is really cool.
And sort of launching off from that like West Texas sort of housing typology that's already there, right? Of like the sort of porches, the long overhangs, the low slope.
The whole idea of it being called Porch House is that Ted Flato says this all the time, there's more porch than house.
Yeah, right.
Because you can do a lot of things outside, and if you have nice shade and big ass fans, or something like that, you can actually have a comfortable space outside, even when it's 110 out and humid.
Right, yeah.
Obviously, we've talked a lot about architecture and sustainability. I think it's fun sometimes to find out what people do themselves in terms of sustainability, like personally. And so at my house that I moved into 4 years ago in Texas, I've done quite a bit of work. I actually installed a 26-year HVAC system. But in addition to that, though, I had them install a zoning board. So where there was one thermostat for the entire house, there's actually 4 thermostats, and then mechanized dampers in the ductwork that open and close. So during the day, for example, I work from home. I can have my office actually a comfortable temperature, but the rest of the house can get hot and a little bit humid. Yeah, so how about you?
For my wife and I, both being architects, and I grew up in the middle of Kansas and 15 acres of land, and we'd have to drive 6 miles into town every time. And she grew up in kind of the suburbs of Colorado Springs, sort of the same thing. We're really passionate about keeping our footprint small. And we still, as a family of 4, have one car, hybrid car. I think me as a small firm, again, right, I have to choose what I'm focusing on. And I can't focus on some of these larger embodied carbon issues or I mean, maybe I choose not to, but the thing I get most passionate about is the sort of passive design of a building and the orientation and the shading and those sort of things that I can control maybe the easiest, and then trying to slowly nudge clients to have better mechanical systems and things like that.
It's interesting you talk about some of the challenges of, as a small firm, being able to do a certain task like an LCA, tracking embodied carbon, and that is a true accurate problem. And I don't think it's unique to the size of the firm, actually. I think there's big firms that they just maybe have other focuses, or they don't have the skill level or the budget on a project. And I think that's where our software friends can help. I've been on this sprint review now for the last year for this Autodesk kind of next gen insight total carbon tool, and they're actually using Building Transparency's EC3 EPD database. There's different aspects of it, and so A1 through A3 has to do with the extraction of the raw material and then bringing it somewhere and turning it into something and then bringing it to the construction site, and all that has this embodied carbon impact. And so if we can minimize that by not using materials when we don't need them, having a exposed brick wall like we have in this space, right? Instead of covering it, because brick can look pretty cool if it's done right. So not using materials, doing more circular economy stuff. In fact, I brought a nice little prop here today that is this circular construction and circular economy book by Felix Heisel. He runs the circular construction lab at Cornell, and it's got all kinds of really great things in there. And the whole depth of circular economy is a huge aspect to sustainability, and that's what Lake Flato even did when we remodeled our office. We actually had this attached one-story garage, and we deconstructed the roof of it and used the wood. It's called downcycling because we're reusing the wood for more aesthetics than structure. But in our phone rooms, we have these wood tabletops that are made from that wood, and they have all these cool little nooks and crannies. And like when I'm in meetings, I'll sit there and rub my fingers on them and just kind of imagine the history.
Think of the history.
Yeah.
It's that thing where it's kind of back to our conversation about efficiency, right? It's messing up the efficiency, it's slowing things down. Like they're doing the same thing in Boulder, Colorado here, where you have to deconstruct your homes, and you know, a lot of people really don't like it, right? It costs a lot more. It's kind of preventative for a lot of these things, but in the long term, it's the right idea.
It's the social cost that we need to
Right.
take into consideration, that climate justice is a bigger umbrella to everything that we do. So I mentioned earlier that I lead our research program at the firm, and we just recently published this white paper on climate futures. When we do energy modeling, we're basing it on historical weather data, right? To determine the predictive EUI, energy use intensity of a project. But really, we know, everybody understands that the climate's changing, and we need to start thinking about the future climate and using that as a model for sizing equipment. And we want to right size things too, right? We don't want to make things like we used to do, dependent on energy and not doing passive strategies, just solving the problem by brute force, burning fossil fuels. And so that's a really important aspect. And of course, if we don't, start getting our heads around this problem, I mean, we have the opportunity to like right the ship. But if we don't focus on this in a real way, it's going to be bad.
The climate change has to be even more visible than it is now, right? And like this is already right, like the hottest summer in history, right? And it's June. It is just a hard thing, right? Of okay, now maybe people are starting to see it better, but how long does it take to turn the ship? And we've been pushing on that, but you can only do so much if we're not in the role of in the deciding roles, I guess. If we're talking about the industry, the architectural industry, and how they're incentivizing or not incentivizing the furthering of sustainable design, I feel like you're in an interesting position where you're part of these high level conversations with the AIA or with Autodesk or something like that, right? That's sort of the 2% of architects, right? There's a lot of us down here. I'm not getting sort of resources tossed at me of saying, here's how we can do it better. It's really coming from, is this client interested in it?
And that's where policy helps, because
Right.
even here in Colorado, right, there's certain areas that have a maximum amount of energy use that you can have on a project. So you could have de-icing driveways, but then you can't have the hot tub, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah.
that takes the onus off of the designer, right? This is the law, and you
Right.
can't go beyond that.
It's sort of easy to talk about architecture in the industry in like a broad sense, right? But then when you get down to sort of brass tacks or whatever, what does this look like in your career or in recent projects or a project that kind of a lot of this has come together with?
We have a project at the University of Maryland at Shady Grove, a biomedical science and engineering building that won a COTE Top 10 award. And I'm really excited about it because it just has so many really cool aspects to it that we researched and implemented and then verified. So it has many biophilic design principles, not just a green wall and some wood framed windows.
Right.
So multiple biophilic design principles. We partnered with academia to do a research project on this building, and it involved researching people. The interesting results were that people did feel like they wanted to be more sustainable, like they wanted to recycle. They felt like it was a healthier building to be in.
I mean, talk about code for a little bit, right? It's an easy term to kind of throw out there, but like it's an important thing of setting up these standards. Yeah.
The cool thing about COTE is its goal is to award up to 10 projects a year that actually implement multiple metrics from the AIA's framework for design excellence, which actually the awards and this framework came out of the COAT committee. It rewards projects that are both beautiful and high performing. High performance design and sustainability aren't mutually exclusive. And in fact, Lake Plato has a sort of saying that design and sustainability are two sides of the same coin.
Right.
And I've sort of riffed off of that. And I like to say that the coin is the technology, the coin itself. So how about you? Do you have some favorite project?
The biggest thing in the sort of like iterations of 4 firms I've been doing now is really trying to project forward. Hey, this is who I am. This is what I'm about, and not just these kitchens that I'm doing. And so at my last firm, Further Architecture, my partner Justin Toward and I did a lot of theoretical projects and just getting them out there, rendering them really well. And one of our favorites was, it's called on our website, the Black Forest House, but it was taken from a spot in the Black Forest outside of Colorado Springs, right next to my in-laws' house, but this very undulating kind of landscape with these huge pine trees. We developed this system of like 3D printed concrete pods that would really house the things that really needed to be enclosed, and then through the arrangement of those pods, created different levels of privacy and things. Orienting that east-west and getting a lot of thermal mass for southern suns coming in, a lot of cross ventilation into the form, solar on the roof, geothermal on the ground. A lot of things. Obviously, it was a theoretical project that we could kind of throw a lot of it out, but it was a sort of project where we said, hey, this is what we believe in, this is what we could do, and getting that out there. I wouldn't say I'm overly passionate about 3D printing within buildings, but then the other project I'm really have become passionate about was a competition another friend and I did for the Icon House Under a House for $99,000 project, but where we were thinking about sort of the constraints of how you're printing a house. And so it was kind of printing it down and then moving it up, right? And then you had to figure out how to put a roof on top of it. And so instead we thought of it as a sort of tilt-up construction where you could print the rings of a house, a section, and then tilt it up and put those rings together in a sort of like exquisite corpse way, and have it be almost like a IKEA type thing where someone could come in and kind of choose those different corpse sections, and then it could come together in different ways and have a lot of volume to it, where you have all the systems within the ring poche of the walls coming together. I think it's interesting, we're both teaching, but like adjunctly, right? I don't want to get totally sucked in that world. I like to have my feet in both worlds, right? But at least here, and I think it's the same a lot of places, there's always this fight between the profession saying, hey, you're not preparing these students well enough when they come out of school, and academia is saying, hey, we can't teach them everything. I think I agree more with academia, actually, of hey, we need to get people to think like an architect, and just the amount of things that they need to be doing and thinking about, much less like since AI, right? Like the amount of new programs, new processes, new things to be thinking about, much less sustainability, much less technology, much less community, cultural, right? There's a lot of things to think about, and saying you need to be good at all this, and you need to know codes, you need to know all this. There's just a lot for them to have to know, right? And not trying to put too much on that, because the profession can really hit you hard, right? And come into it. It's interesting, you teaching at a university far away, right? And you knowing those students and then going out and probably having some connection with them, but you're not getting coffee with them every week, right? So like kind of what are you seeing with those students up in the Dakotas area?
They're exactly like you described. They have a lot of things that they're trying to absorb and understand. And my job with the small subset that I get to talk to is to share some technology and sustainability, like instill that idea of its importance and how it'll help them get a job. And really, ideally, they'll find a firm that can support them. Being at a firm that's just a fun place to be, it doesn't have to be like TV where they're hanging out 24/7,
Right.
like you don't
Yeah.
have a family life or a life outside of work. But at Lake Plato, there's people who spend a ton of time together at different times and different venues. And when it comes to like learning and expanding your knowledge once you're outside of academia into practice, I think there's some really interesting opportunities. To come back to the idea of education and things being overwhelming for students once they get out into the practice, some of that has to do with where they're working, and some of it has to do with their other personal interests and hobbies, and all that's fair.
Yeah.
It's a challenge, but people, work-life balance,
Yeah.
it's a real thing.
Kind of stepping back a little bit, what I'm interested in with academia or with the profession is just thinking again about the longer lineage of architecture and the profession, and the lineage of graphic representation. We can talk about sort of how buildings perform, how these all things, but also how does it look, right? Like how are we drawing, how are we thinking about it? And so, I teach studio at CU Denver here, and then I've taught a lot of different seminars, and thinking about how do we take these drawing and modeling tools and stretch them and kind of try to break them into helping fit into that lineage of drawing. Like if you go on my website, I'm passionate about having drawings on all projects, right? It frustrates me that you go to a lot of architect websites and there's not a single drawing. It's all just photographs. All the drawings that I have on there, they're all straight out of Revit, but they're all line weighted like you would of Illustrator or whatever, and using that in different ways to draw. And so then teaching the students to, yeah, don't just take what comes right out of the box, right out of the computer, right? How are you making your drawings beautiful? How are you communicating well? And how are you pushing the sort of act of communication? I teach different seminars where I have them sort of combine the idea of a story, of whatever story, a fairy tale or something like that, within a graphic representation style that they have to copy and figure out how to draw that way, and then they have to redraw that story and add in another like architectural precedent. So it's forcing them to do it in different ways, and then creating these like large 6 foot long like tapestries of work where it's based off like Where's Waldo books, where you're trying to get into detail and it's changing scale and doing these things. And so trying not to lose that history of drawing and representation and storytelling within this, because yeah, it is important that all these buildings, we need to be more sustainable, we need to be good with culture and community and all this, but there's a practice of architecture that's also that, right?
So this idea of graphic representation is really cool. It made me think of a few things, and this isn't going to totally disagree with what you just said. No, just to help prove that a little bit, 2 of my 19 textbooks are on architectural hand drawing.
There you go.
Yeah, but in terms of contract delivery, I'm a big fan of trying to get ourselves weaned off of PDFs and like the single source of truth of the Revit model being the deliverable. Like for a while now, the AIA has had this E200 series contracts. That's an amendment that allows the model to be the deliverable. Lake Plato being known as a design first firm, we like to make sure everything works and is like really well thought out. And on our residential projects, it's really interesting. Recently, we were looking to implement a new detail library system. And those are typically based on drafting views, which is basically like a 2D drawing space in Revit, right? That's infinite, and everything that you draw there is completely disconnected from the actual model. And so our residential studio that only uses Revit, we did a survey of like 10 or 20 of the most recent projects that they said that they were really happy with. And across all of those projects, there were a total of 5, not per model, 5 drafting views. Like everything is live sections, and there's still notes and things added, but that changed the metrics basically on a firm-wide detail library that you could use and implement.
Speaking about education and just the amount of things to know, right? Like we're really at this big revolution point, right, with AI, where it's only been about a year, right? And it's just how much there is to keep up with, and the potentials of things, right? So like, how have you guys been using AI?
There's a lot of really interesting things we've been looking at to try and understand it as a tool to basically allow for more creativity, efficiency, accuracy, and all of those things are possible now with the current tools in varying degrees. I was doing a training on Autodesk Construction Cloud, and I asked the Zoom Whiteboard AI to give me a mind map of this training, which is pretty niche topic. And it had like 85% of what I planned on covering. It had a couple things I didn't think about, and then a couple things were kind of basic or not relevant.
It said, "Don't worry, Dan. I've been listening to you for weeks. I know exactly what you need." I think it is such a frontier that we're at, and talking about Firefly and sort of image generation. There can be such fear around it, and of, okay, this thing's gonna take my job. You know, I have this fear of, right now there's a client who's telling me what they want. I'm putting it into Midjourney or Veris, and then it's popping out 20 options, and I'm going down to 3 options, and then I'm giving it to the client, and they're choosing. But what's going to stop it from taking me out of the process, and they're just looking at 20 options and choosing one and going, right? And we were talking earlier, I think we have a mutual friend with Bill Allen, the founder of Evolve Lab, and developing Veris. And I had him on my podcast. He actually, in the very early days of Evolve Lab, he rented a space from one of the firms I was at, so I was like sitting next to him all the time. But we had this conversation, and everybody's saying it now, but AI is not going to take your jobs. An architect using AI is going to take your job. I think he sort of won me over in a lot of ways of how you're using it, and how it's still just a tool, right? But it is interesting of how it can expand our capacities. And I think I've been really loving using Midjourney to create like concept images. It's a real pet peeve of mine of people doing Lumion poorly, doing Twinmotion poorly, Enscape poorly, where it looks like some tropical beach and you're in wherever. It's not representing the actual place. I've been really enjoying using Twinmotion, where now it's great, where it's right inside of Revit now, and rendering kind of basic context, but then using different Rhone diffusion kind of stuff to enhance that landscape, and then using upscale programs like Magnificent or something like that can really blow up that detail and then give you that sense of reality in place without changing the architecture.
I think one of the interesting things, kind of reflecting on everything we've talked about, is what does success look like personally and as a practice? What are your thoughts on that? I have a few, but I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I'll probably take this in a real personal way, but just throughout my whole career, I've just jumped around so much, and the grass is always greener, and I always want to kind of sample from different things, and now that I have this firm, even, I think about this a lot, because I really get frustrated with the profession and with the process of architecture. And as a one-person firm, you have to wear all the hats, and I'm only good at wearing maybe 25% of the hats. I don't like doing a lot of construction documents. I don't like doing a lot of things, and figuring out what that means. And I think it's a really interesting time in how media and how technology is intersecting with architecture and allowing for different kind of job roles and things, and how that will help me get out of this sort of frustrating, typical fee-for-service architecture model. I see it in 2 ways. One way is of these big mega firms always kind of swallowing up and having a lot of great resources and a lot of things, opportunities there. But then also on a sort of individual side, where we can start kind of pooling together and coming together as kind of consultants for each other, and implementing these different skill sets that we all have in more kind of flexible ways. But it's not a clear path, and then it's kind of the exciting thing. And so I think what I'm really passionate about is just how do we better communicate this amazing world of architecture that we're so deep into to the public, and how can we share, hey, there's this lineage of architecture of crafting the built environment, and here's what it means to be architecture or good architecture. And also then, right, of here's how we can make the world better. Here's a better way to do these things. Here's a more efficient way. Here's this, right? And so I think success for me is I'm probably not going to be doing those things, but I'm helping to lift up others and to share those voices and explore those more with people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Now, what about you? With you're just this walking, amazing encyclopedia of knowledge, and just slowly, not even slowly, just exploding it out everywhere to everybody that you can. But what does that success maybe look like for you?
Well, success on the practice side is kind of the angle I'm going to take. Actually, has a couple of aspects of it: culture, strategy, training and support, metrics, and awards. Really, like Lake Plato, I don't think ever approaches a project. I'm going to start at the end, saying we're gonna win an award on this one. I mean, I think truly, honestly, that all projects, the staff is so dedicated to the craft and to design, and like all of them could be submitted for awards. I mean, there are again challenges and things that happen, but every problem is a design solution opportunity. Another aspect of it is firm culture, but also the idea of training and support. Like, the old saying, like, what if we train them and they leave? And the retort is, what if we don't train them and they stay?
That's funny.
Right? So
Right.
if we want to provide really high quality training so that, that builds the culture of sustainability, like a platform for people to do
Right.
really well, and then support, you have to be able to offer real-time support and documentation. So having those sort of resources are really important, and then walking the walk, for our company to actually do climate action positive business practices.
Right, yeah.
We have the skill and the agency. We just need to actually apply it and make the world a better place.
This has been awesome, great meeting you and just learning all this information and having these chats, which I think are so cool. So I look forward to keeping in touch.
Likewise, I mean, all the stuff you've done as a sole practitioner and having this podcast and just really putting yourself out there is really inspiring.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool.
Good talking.